Assalamu alaikum students. The topic that we'll be doing today is metaphysical poetry. Uh, what exactly is metaphysical poetry? इसकी जो basic definition है बेटे वो ये it is a highly intellectualized form of poetry. यानी कि ये इस तरह की poetry होती है जिसमें emotions से ज़्यादा intellect यानी कि जहन के हिसाब से ये लिखी जाती है. It is very very intellectual, बहुत deep होती है. And what exactly do we find in it? We find in it very bold and ingenuous conceits. Bold yani बहुत sharp sort of conceits या imagery जो है इसके अंदर you sort of find. Now, what exactly is ingenuous is something that is unusual. इसकी जो imagery it is unusual, unlike that we find in other kind of poetry, and at the same time it is also incongruous. That is बहुत diverse है यानी कि different fields of life के जो images हैं they are brought together जो बहुत ही generally other forms of poetry में नहीं होते. They are very diverse, different stratas of life say they are pulled together and brought forth in the form of a very intellectual poetry, and that is termed as metaphysical poetry. And because of this, metaphysical poetry is known for its complexity. It is not easy to understand. इसमें बहुत intricate and complex thought involved होती है, which is present in a lot of subtlety. That means in a very delicate fashion. उसको इतने खूबसूरती के साथ merge किया जाता है that you are able to get the thought process exactly how it is presented, of course with a lot of thinking involved, because then like I said is a very deep and intellectual form of poetry. Also what we find in metaphysical poetry is the frequent use of paradox, यानी दो बिल्कुल ऑपोजिट चीजों को साथ लाके जो पोएट है वो अपनी थॉट को बयान करता है. Now, what exactly metaphysical means? So the word meta means after. So metaphysical यानी something जो beyond the physical reality exist करे, यानी कि जो हमें superficial level पे जो चीजें नजर आती हैं उससे beyond जो चीजें exist करती हैं, they come under the domain of metaphysics. That's why metaphysics generally or metaphysical poetry generally questions answers जो कि science हमें answer नहीं करती. And that is how is it answered? It is answered in a very philosophical way. And that is why जो generally metaphysical poetry के topics होते हैं they range from religious to consciousness, यानी कि मजहबी aspect से भी different metaphysical poetry में चीजें लिखी जाती हैं, and then human consciousness यानी इंसान के जहन में जो multiple सवाल questions जो science resolve नहीं कर सकती वो through metaphysical poetry a lot of poets have tried to resolve. Therefore, metaphysics is about exploration and philosophy and not about science and mathematics. अब कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स क्या है मेटाफिजिकल पोइट्री के, या मेटाफिजिकल पोइट्री जो है उसकी क्या क्वालिटीज होती हैं. मेटाफिजिकल पोइट जो हैं जिन्होंने पोइट्री लिखी, ये पहली दफा जो टर्म है इट वाज यूज्ड बाय दिस वन क्रिटिक whose name was Samuel Johnson, and at that point in time he sort of put in a certain category of poets of the 17th century जो एक बहुत टिपिकल तरीके से कंसीट्स या इमेजेस यूज करते थे अपने पोइट्री के अंदर, एंड दे यूज्ड टू राइट अबाउट टॉपिक्स सच एज लव एंड रिलीजन. Ab these poets were not following a certain pattern thoughtfully. Yeah, it's not like they were reading each other's work or inspired by one another, but it happened coincidentally these people in one particular style started writing a style that was intelligent and witty. यानी कि बहुत उसके अंदर sharp humor. Witty refers to some sort of very sharp humor that was prevalent in these poems. And then again ये kind of poetry religious भी थी और ironical भी थी. There's a lot of irony that was involved, and because of that जो intended meaning था of the poem was sometimes in complete contrast to what the poet was actually trying to say. So now metaphysical poetry baki poetry say was very sort of different. And why was it different? Because it was not just intellectual, but इसके अंदर imagery जो थी वो बहुत strange होती थी, complicated होती थी, because then again जो thoughts themselves थी, they were very complicated as well. Now major themes क्या होती थी, यानी कि बुनियादी या main idea in metaphysical poetry क्या होता था कि it used to be spiritual and it had a lot of religious themes. Spiritual अंदर से रूहानियत के aspects बहुत ज़्यादा इसके अंदर थे, and then of course it had certain religious themes, and then again love, religion, union of the soul. These were major key themes that were found amongst metaphysical poets. मेटाफिजिकल पोइट्री के अंदर प्राइमरी लिटरेरी डिवाइसेस क्या थे? व्हाट वर द काइंड ऑफ लिटरेरी डिवाइसेस that were found in metaphysics? Literary devices refers to कि वो कौन से sort of tools थे, या वो कौन से तरीके थे, वो कौन सा structure था, वो किस तरह के लफ्ज थे, वो किस तरह की imagery थी जो poets लेके चलते थे in order to bring forth their thought through metaphysical poetry. So metaphysical poets generally used metaphors, yani बहुत extended symbolism, puns, yani ki words with multiple meanings, paradoxes, that is bringing opposite things together, and a certain kind of meter, yani ki the way the flow of the poem jo tha, वो कैसे लेकर आते थे, and they were all put together in order to create a lot of drama and tension in the poem. इसके अलावा मेटाफिजिकल पोएट्स जो है certain scientific words भी use करते थे, words coming from the medical domain, legal words and phrases were also presented in metaphysical poetry, but generally it was done to bring about answers to thoughts that were philosophical in nature, or which sort of resolved or try to answer the philosophical aspects of life. Metaphysical poetry जो है, it's a little difficult to understand, primarily because the thoughts are also complicated, and then at the same time जो इसकी conceit है या इसका symbolism है, इसका imagery है, वो बहुत diverse elements से constitute होती है. That is why metaphysical poetry is highly ambiguous and obscure. That is, there is no sort of clear cut understanding to it. Ambiguous, there are certain answers that are left unanswered, and obscure, it is hard to understand, because again, because it is highly intellectual, and metaphysical poets themselves brought in so many images from diverse backgrounds that it made the understanding extremely complicated for the reader. The poetry is therefore challenging to understand at the first reading, and it needs a lot of concentration in order to get into the root of the problem जो कि poet is trying to put forth through his poetry. However, जो ideas जो इतने complex होते हैं, metaphysical poets always bring that in a very brief and concise manner. Metaphysical poetry बहुत generally short होती है, बहुत लंबी नहीं होती है, because every line is infused with so many ideas in very few words, and therefore every word is adjusted in every line like a brick in a wall and conveys the message of the author, and there is practically no wastage of words. So every word has so much depth to it that the poet is able to bring about a very complex thoughts with very few words. अब metaphysical conceits या metaphysical imagery जो है, जो के अंदर metaphysical poetry का essence है, that is something that is of a very unique quality. Generally, conceit की अगर हम definition देखें तो conceit is a comparison of very two dissimilar, यानी कि बहुत different चीजों को जब हम on the basis of one common quality साथ में लेके आते हैं, तो that is known as a metaphysical conceit. And example एक metaphysical poet का दे रही हूँ, उसकी poem Abraham Cowley, in his poem The Mistress, for example, compares his love for ladies to his habit of traveling in various countries of the world. So now these are very sort of diverse things जो generally poetry के अंदर as a sense of analogy, a comparison नहीं use होता. But Abraham Cowley, being a metaphysical poet, compares these two things on the basis of one common quality, that is his immense admiration or likeness for ladies and for traveling. Another key element of metaphysical poetry is the originality of thought. Metaphysical poets don't generally write about something that has been repeatedly written upon. उनके अपने unique ideas होते हैं, अपने unique thoughts होते हैं, which were very different from their other contemporary poets, यानी कि poets जो उनके times में लिखते थे, उनसे बहुत फर्क. They sort of stood apart, not just in their writing style, but also in the themes and the treatment of themes in their poetry. मेटाफिजिकल पोइट्री में इवन दो बहुत कॉम्प्लेक्स और कॉम्प्लिकेटेड थॉट्स को एड्रेस किया जाता है, बट एट द सेम टाइम देयर इज अ लॉट ऑफ शार्पनेस ऑफ ह्यूमर, जिसे हम विट भी कहते हैं, that is also present in metaphysical poetry. And one particular metaphysical poet who's probably the most famous poet of all times, John Donne, has been termed as the monarch of wit. And monarch, and a king of wit, in the history of metaphysical poetry until today, John Donne is probably one of the most famous metaphysical poets. Then again, famous metaphysical poets include John Donne, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, and Henry Vaughan. और but इनमें सबसे ज़्यादा famous जो हैं, he's been John Donne and his legacy of metaphysical poems that he wrote. We will obviously have another lecture specifically on John Donne and the legacy that he's left behind in the form of metaphysical poetry. So then again, girls, metaphysical poetry, I'd repeat again, is poetry that addresses extremely intellectual thoughts and notions through very complex imagery, जिसे हम metaphysical conceits भी कहते हैं, by bringing in images from very diverse backgrounds in order to address thoughts that are generally intellectual in nature and that exist beyond the physical world. और major themes जो metaphysical poetry में वो होती हैं, they pertain to intellect, religion, and the true meaning of love. I hope you understand, girls, and we will continue with John Donne as a metaphysical poet in our next lecture. Thank you so much.